In today's video, I share with you about the HeyGears pulsing release module and their new PARP10 resin. But before we get into today's video, just want to share with you what the GGGGs are for this month. Each month, Bob the Beholder picks some of my Patreon supporters to receive gratitude gifts. And for this month of July of 2024, we have 3 Patreon supporters receiving the Monster Gaming RPG Spell Stat Tracker, which is currently on Kickstarter right now. These are really cool spell trackers that I always found challenging to keep track of manually, just writing on a piece of paper whenever I play D&D. But this is a way to really easily keep track of how many slots you have, how many spells you have remaining. And currently it has raised almost $10,000. You can pledge for one of them for $25 or 2 of them for $45. And this campaign will end July 25th. So go ahead and use the link below if you want to go to the Kickstarter page and pledge for that. Or use my link to go to my Patreon page where you can find out how you can get in on the possibility of receiving one of these by being chosen by Bob at the end of the month. Also, $100 going towards a crowdfunding campaign, which my Patreon supporters are currently voting upon. So it only takes $1 to become a Patreon supporter and have a chance to be picked by Bob. If you haven't seen already, go ahead and check out this video where I do a review of the HeyGears UltraCraft Reflex. And the summary of that video is basically it is cutting edge in terms of all the features that it has and how automated it makes resin printing from all of the other machines that are available out there. The downside is that it is very expensive at $1,400 just for the resin printer, and then all the accessories are pretty steep as well. And the resin is relatively expensive. The PARP10, which I use for miniature printing, is about $60 a bottle. My general recommendation was to not purchase it unless you were flush with money and can afford top-of-the-line products. And if you wanted most of the procedures automated for you, which is what the machine is really great for. Now, having since done that video, I've been using that machine for a number of months now, and I found that I consistently use the UltraCraft Reflex over my GK2, which again, I think is my #1 recommendation for most people that are getting into resin printing. But overall, I have found it to be much easier just to use the UltraCraft Reflex over the GK2, and that the supports are much thinner and easier to remove off of the UltraCraft Reflex, and the amount of detail that I can get on my prints is really, really good. Just naturally over time, I've just found myself using the UltraCraft Reflex over my other resin printers. So again, I think my recommendation is still the same. If you can afford it, I do think that the machine is worth the $1,400. Don't buy the washing station. Don't buy the curing station. You can buy much more cheap options that aren't part of HeyGears. But definitely, I think that the machine is worth the $1,400 price tag. It is painful to pay $60 for a bottle of resin, but today I'm happy to say that this PARP10 resin is the cheapest resin that HeyGears produces. At $45 a bottle, this is actually coming in competitive prices with some of the higher end resins that you can buy. So for example, Funcracol is about this price range for a 1 kilogram bottle of resin. So I think at $45, this is actually pretty affordable. As we're gonna see when I check out the resiliency test, the toughness test, and the detail test, I think this is actually a pretty viable one for printing out miniatures, but we'll get to that in a little bit. Here are a couple of samples of what I printed out on the UltraCraft Reflex with both the PARP10, my go-to miniature resin, as well as this new PARP10. Now, the PARP10 is specifically for miniatures, and when you go through the slicing software, you get to the PARP10 when you select miniature printing. Whereas the PARP10 is actually for modeling. And so again, when you go through the slicer, you have to select on modeling in order to have PARP10 show up as an option. Obviously, I'm printing miniatures with both, so that doesn't really matter. You're here probably trying to figure out whether or not this is viable for miniature printing. So first I want to share about the pulsing release module. So HeyGears did send that to me along with these resins. although I do not receive payment for making these review videos so that I can be honest with my feedback. But the pulsing release module is claimed to make prints 20% faster and using 25% less supports for a similar model. So I ran tests with both types of resin that I have with this new resin, as well as the PARP10 with the pulsing release module and without, just to see if that was true, if it printed faster, and if there was less supports. And sure enough, that was the case. Now, what is the pulsing release module? I'm not entirely sure how it works, but it just seems to be a pump that pulses out air underneath the FEP and the LCD screen, and for whatever reason, that might make release of the print from the FEP maybe easier. And because it's going to be easier to release off of that FEP, you don't need as thick of supports in order to keep the model onto the build plate. That's sort of my theory of how that works, but again, not 100% sure. And my tests have proven that it actually does work. It does print faster, although not significantly faster. I took a 12-hour print in the normal mode to about 10 hours, so that is true, about 20% faster. And there is less supports, which was actually key in using the PARP10, because the PARP10 actually requires thicker and more support points than does the PARP10. So the place that I really noticed the difference was when I was using the PARP10 resin. The PARP10 already has few supports and the connection points aren't that big, so you don't get a lot of scarring that you have to sand off with the PARP10. But with the PARP10, I definitely did see a difference using the pulse release module, as it had less supports and less thicker points of contact on the model. Now, would I say that it's worth $650 to have that feature, as that's how much the pulse release module is? And additionally, you cannot use the same vat as you do with the normal mode. You have to get a special one that allows air to come underneath. I would say no, it's not worth $650. That $650 you can actually use to buy a different resin printer. And again, like I mentioned, if you are using PARP10, which is high detail miniature prints, you actually don't need the pulse release module. But I would say if you're going to be using less detailed and resin that requires more supports, then I would say that that's a great feature to have. But again, $650, that is a lot of money. I do know that Ross from Fohammer said that he was able to customize the supports even thinner than what is stock in the machine. Now, I haven't messed with the supports at all. I just go through whatever the slicer pulls up. The auto supports in the HeyGears slicer is awesome. Whenever I get my STLs, I get it unsupported, because the supports that HeyGears creates in its slicer is superior to any auto supports that I found on the market. So I haven't had a felt need, but Ross told me that he was able to get the supports even down thinner than what is stock automatic with auto supports, and he said that it was amazing, so I trust what he says. Let's go ahead now look at the comparison between the PARP10 and the PARP10 in terms of toughness as well as detail. Alright, so this is the PARP10, specific for miniatures, and the details on this, as usual, is amazing. One of the things that I want you to note is just these scales here that you can see on the chin, because that's just an amazing level of detail, and you would expect that from resin that is specifically designed for miniatures. Now, let's compare that with the PARP10, which is your all-around cheaper resin, and details on this also is excellent. And these are printed at 0.03 millimeter height, so the finer detail here, you can't see layer lines at all. But check out the chin, the comparison with the chin. So look at the details here on this one, on the chin, the scales, and you can see that the scales are not quite as distinct with the PARP10. So I would say that the details on the PARP10 is actually greater than the details that you're going to find on here, but at a level that most people are not going to notice. So when you take a look at this from about just regular distance, I don't know if you would ever be able to tell the qualitative difference, especially when you have a layer of paint on top of this. I mean, both are just excellent. Even though I will say that there's less detail on here than on this one, the detail still is pretty darn good. But one of the differences that you're going to notice between these two is I went ahead, whenever I pull off prints off of the supports, comes off really cleanly. You'll notice that this headdress all came off as one piece intact, and the supports for the PARP10, you'll notice, is a lot thinner than with the PARP10 or the PARP10. So the diameter of the columns is thicker with the PARP10, and my guess is that's because the PARP10 needs more supports overall. That's my guess. And the connections up here seem thinner than over here. And that was proven when I was pulling this off. I actually yanked off a bunch of the headdress up here. It came off, and you know, I wasn't being super careful because I thought this was going to come off the same way that it did for the PARP10, so I wasn't super careful. So when I pulled it off, I accidentally ripped all of this off. Now you can prevent that if you're a little bit more careful than I was, trying to pull off this whole piece. So this seems not only a little bit less detailed than the PARP10, removing it from the supports was harder as well. And you'll notice down here where there is some support scarring, there is a little bit here with the PARP10, but it is noticeably less than over here with the PARP10. See all these right there versus the edge right here. It's just a lot less noticeable there. So now here is the difference using the pulsing release module, which is supposed to have 20% less need for supports and prints 20% faster. Now let's go ahead and compare. I waited until I could record this. I do think there's actually less support material for this with the pulsing release module than there is with this. But let's see if the connections are actually smaller as well, and it's easier to pull this off where I'm not ripping or destroying the headdress while I'm pulling the supports off. So down here with the body, I'm able to pull this out like this. And let's see up here where the difference is with the headdress. Am I able to pull it off without ripping off? And yep, sure enough, I retain all of the headdress. Whereas on this one, I yanked off this bottom piece. So actually, I do think that the pulsing release module allows you to have thinner supports. And let's look at this point of scarring. So barely any scarring happening there. Again, let's compare it to the scarring on here with the supports. So the connection points with the pulsing release module definitely is smaller than with the normal non-pulse. The detail level seems about the same, so let's go ahead and take a look at the chin here. It's about the same level of detail, not as good as the PARP10 model with the chin. You're seeing more scale detail there. But I definitely think that the supports are easier to remove with the pulsing release module, even with the PARP10 resin. You can grab these off really easily, like this. It comes off. I mean, really easy to remove the supports. So I think that's one of the key things and advantages with the pulsing release module. Now let's go ahead and take a look at how flexible these resins are. Again, this is the PARP10. We'll go ahead and rip these off. And this was printed not with a pulsing release module, and you'll notice that for whatever reason, the PARP10 supports are really thin, and you can remove them very easily without breaking any of these things. So let's see how flexible the spear is. I did go ahead and bake it for 2 minutes, and it's actually pretty flexible, which is a good sign. So let's see how far I can go. Oh, there it snapped. So it isn't as flexible as it is with the Sunlu Toughness resin printed on my GK2. But there is a good amount of flex to it. So it's not just going to break if you happen to drop the model. There's a little bit of flex. Let's go ahead and go to the PARP10. And this is without the pulsing release module. It is harder, I'm noticing, to remove these, but I'm still able to do it without breaking the spear. But I do notice a difference. There's a lot more grip to the supports here. And this too has some good flexibility to it. Let's see how far I can go before this snaps. Oh, look at that. Actually, the PARP10 seems to be more flexible, although there is that breaking point. So it does seem to be more flexible than the PARP10. So maybe in terms of resiliency, the PARP10 is the way to go. Now, same spear, but this time with the pulsing release module. Let's see if it's any easier to remove. And it is. It's about the same amount of removal effort as the PARP10, which requires less supports. And I imagine resiliency is going to be the same. So yes, pretty flexible. Let's see the breaking point here. Yeah, look at that. So the PARP10 is more flexible and resilient. This is going to translate to being resilient to drops, because these bits won't break off if you drop them. So actually this is more flexible. Look at that up here. So you're giving up a little bit of detail in the print in order to have more flexibility and it not breaking as much. Although all the miniatures that I printed with the PARP10 has pretty good flexibility to it, so I'm relatively happy with these miniatures not breaking quickly. So you can take that for what it is, but you are giving up detail, a little bit of detail, for the flexibility in these prints. So here's another model that I actually printed out in the PARP10, just to show you that this level of detail is more than acceptable. This is a 75mm model, and the amount of detail that you're going to find here is, again, perfectly fine. If you look here on her legging, there's a little bit of texture that you can see there. So the amount of detail, again, I think you're not sacrificing a whole lot by going with the slightly more flexible PARP10 and a little bit more resilient. This is the base of the model. And again, here, I just don't think you're giving up a lot of detail that's even that noticeable on a model like this. Now there is some scarring from these supports that you can see here on the back side. But overall, I mean, look at the amount of detail that's found here on this base. I do also want to give a quick shout out. This is the Epic War Demon from One Page Rules. Also, I have a model here. I don't quite remember the name, but I did a video for him. But I'll put the name of the company right here. And there are going to be links for all of these products in the descriptions of the video. And then here from across the realm, I have these awesome Dino Riders, which I think look super cool and motivated me to go ahead and paint them up, as well as this awesome battle tank from across the realms for my Imperial guard babes that I have been working on. So there you have it. Hopefully this video is helpful for you. I know many of you can't afford the HeyGears UltraCraft Reflex. Again, for those of you who can, I definitely do suggest getting the $1,400 just base resin printer without any of the accessories. I actually do think it's worth it. Just like I think that the X1 Carbon is worth being over $1,000, that printer itself, especially if you're printing out more exotic filaments, that is definitely the go-to printer. In the resin printing world, I think the UltraCraft Reflex is the top of the line that you can get and the easiest to use and get into resin printing. So again, if you can afford it, I do think that the UltraCraft Reflex is worth it, even if you're paying the higher price. And now that they have the PARP10, which is actually more affordable, I especially think that that is a game changer enough to say this is a good product to get into. There's a ton of other products, just like the GK2, but also Elegoo and some of the other main manufacturers for resin printers. Those are going to cost more like $600, $500. So there's tons of cheaper options that are out there for resin printing. But if you do want top of the line, I think that the UltraCraft Reflex is top of the line. Go ahead and hit the like button and subscribe. Make comments below if you have any thoughts about the UltraCraft Reflex, if you do think that it is worth that steep price. And I know many of you have said that having proprietary resin is a no-go for you. Absolutely respect that. I do think that that's one of the issues, but it is a closed system, and because of that, many of the features can be automated without you fiddling around with any of the settings. Use the link below to also go to my Patreon page, where again you can get a chance of being chosen by Bob for one of the GGGGs for this month. Otherwise, happy printing. We'll see you next time.